Hello everyone. This is Dr. Narayan. You are all welcome to this session. This section particularly will explain about the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. But before going to discuss about the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning, let's discuss about what exactly the conditioning. Simply, conditioning means when the natural or unconditioned stimulus like food paired with a neutral or conditioned stimulus that is bail for a quite long time. The neutral stimulus acquired the properties or power of the natural stimulus or the unconditioned stimulus, and it leads and evokes the responses, which is called the conditioned response. And this process is called the conditioning. So further, I am giving example of unconditioned stimulus, meaning that the meat powder or food is the unconditioned stimulus, while bail is the neutral stimulus. Meaning that when the meat is placed and contingently bail is given, after a quite long time, the bail will acquire the power of the meat powder and will help or evokes the responses. That response we call as the conditioned response, and that is called as the conditioning. So now let's differentiate classical conditioning from the operant conditioning. The first difference is that the Ivan P. Pavlov was the proponent of classical conditioning, while B.F. Skinner was the proponent of the operant conditioning. Classical conditioning involves the association between involuntary or automatic responses and a stimulus. This means that the saliva of a dog is automatic or reflexive in nature because the response elicited automatically without making any effort, while operant conditioning is about associating a voluntary response or the behavior, for example, random activity of the rat in the cage and pressing the lever is the voluntary response or behavior, and the consequences after getting the lever, after pressing the lever, rat is getting out, or the lever is opening and he is getting outside and getting the food. So that is the consequences or the reward or the result he got. So therefore I am saying operant conditioning is about the associating a voluntary response and a consequences. This means that the rat operates the environment to get the reinforcement or the punishment. Therefore, simply I can say classical conditioning involves the associating between involuntary response and a stimulus, while operant conditioning is about associating a voluntary responses and a consequences. The second difference is that in classical conditioning, the responses, meaning the salivation of the dog, depends upon the presentation of the unconditioned stimulus, meaning that meat powder. This implies that stimulus is placed before responses, thus behavior is relatively passive in nature. While in operant conditioning, the presentation of the reinforcer, for example, the pressing lever, this implies that the stimulus is placed after response, thus behavior is relatively active in nature. The next important difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning is that behavior is elicited due to the influence of the external stimuli. While in operant conditioning, behavior is emitted because the rate starts voluntary or natural response to the circumstances, meaning that the rate operates the environment without getting stimulated or the influenced by the external stimuli. The fifth difference is that organism learns through association or connection in case of classical conditioning. But in operant conditioning, learning occurs by reinforcement or punishment. The next, which is the sixth difference, is that condition response decreases when conditional stimulus is repeatedly presented alone, while in operant response decreases when reinforcement stops. The seventh difference is that neutral stimulus is paired with unconditioned stimulus to become a conditioned stimulus in case of classical conditioning, while operant response is associated with consequences, meaning that associated with a particular reinforcement or a punishment. The last but not least, classical conditioning, called as the respondent conditioning, while operant conditioning is called as instrumental conditioning, where the organism operate the instrument operate the environment. So this is about to brief discussion on the difference between classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Thank you very much for watching this session. I hope this session will strengthen your intellectual capacity. Thank you once again.